The idea is to have a general discussion session, and by general this means that it is really inclusive. That is, comments or questions do not necessarily to have to be addressed to the lecturers, but of course this is not excluded, and I guess initially most of them will be, as is quite natural. But the idea is to try to encourage everyone here to openly discuss and debate without the usual restrictions in terms of, usually participants are asked to be very concise, ask questions, not digress or elaborate too much. We're trying to do without these usual restrictions, which of course entails its risks. But in the past, more often than not, this setup has proved quite productive in terms of opening up the debates. Debate not necessarily producing all answers, but sometimes even approximating a better or a more precise reformulation of the questions can be productive, I guess. So that's the general outline of the rules of the game. And now, so the floor is open for each and every one of you. Does anyone want to break the ice?
Icebreaker. Who will be icebreaker?
Well, if not, then I can try. And well, so many questions popped up that could be followed up on. But maybe one of the questions, and this is maybe returning a bit more to the question of the weaknesses of the left and what we can perceive is what it's if we treat according to well, there is this, I believe, Walter Benjamin's formulation that every form of fascism is the consequence of a failed revolution, something along those lines. I probably mangled that, but what that suggests is to some extent, at least, that even the rise of the radical right or a new right can in itself be interpreted as a symptom of the absence or the weakness of the left. And of course, in the context of, for example, Didier Eribon wrote this very influential book in France and Germany. It has only been now translated into English, about who to some extent tries to explain through his own family history and the rise of the Front National as a consequence of the abandoning of the social questions by the forces of the left, traditional forces. It's the Socialist Party, but also the Communist Party. So this is not so adventurous proposal. But the question would be, and now I'm talking from the perspective of someone who thinks of himself as a leftist or a Marxist in fundamentally, well, methodological terms, in the sense that if we assume, or a materialist in the broader sense, that, and I believe that any form of plausible materialism, the plausibility of materialism, let's phrase it, and Marxism as one form of it, or the dominant, the most developed form in terms of, I mean, materialism in terms of approach in social sciences. Its plausibility rests on the assumption that we cannot understand the behavior and including the political behavior, the orientation of people, without taking into account the conditions of the very reproduction of their material life and the social relations which structure this reproduction of their material life. So this would mean, and this would something that I believe Danijela also mentioned quite emphatically, that this division between class and identity politics can be a heuristically potentially useful device. But if you look closer at it, there are no class subjects on the one side and then identitarian subjects on the other side. We are always already both class subjects and gendered subjects and sexualized subjects and whatnot. So this is a heuristic academic division, which has its analytical purposes and values, of course. But the question is now, do we simply say along Laclauian lines, well, it's all a big, it's a change of equivalence, and we cannot prioritize any moment with regard to any other. We cannot assume not only the primacy of one element over the other, but even causal relations between them, or anything, any structural relations between them beyond the contingency of discursive operations. And this is something I believe that Panagiotis also rightfully criticized, that it's never only discourse, it's always already materially manifest and embedded. And the question then, if this is the case, if we accept this, not everybody has to accept this, but for me the question is, if we accept this materialist and for me in its Marxist version assumption that that if you look at and try to explain social processes and political processes, that you have to take into account the fundamental structures that, well, define and structure material reproduction. Any type of political discourse, any type of interpellation, if we will, ideological or whatnot, must in some respect be connected to this, respond to the questions and the imperatives arising from the need of material reproduction, which in a class society is, has a distinct class character to it. And then the question is, what is it that then, if we assume that class is always already something that structures people's choices, not only life chances, but also that it saturates your own everyday rationality, your common sense in everyday life. But what we know, that it does not necessarily have to take the form of class consciousness in the emphatic sense proposed by some Marxist traditions. What then is it that makes, for example, right-wing discourse or nationalist discourse plausible as a reply to the general predicaments of the imperatives of reproduction in everyday life? Because if we don't take that question seriously, I believe we're left with the alternative to assuming that people are idiots, that they're seduced by nationalist ideology against their own class interests. And class interest is then something that defines, I don't know, a leftist theoretician defines it, what it is and how it is supposed to manifest itself. But if we accept that class is a structural force, but it does not necessarily lead to a form of class subjectivation, that complicates the question of leftist politics, insofar as you have mentioned, a more immediate articulation of class cleavage. Well, that can also take obviously many forms, like particularist struggles of work of particular workers in particular either countries or sectors of the economy and so on. And we know, if you look at the Yugoslav experience, that this is the case. And also the Yugoslav experience points to this. Why could nationalism become a discourse through which also social grievances were articulated? Because if we assume that social and class-based issues played absolutely no role, then we are left with the question, why didn't people respond to it? Why did they recognize something in it? So, well, that would be a very elaborate introduction to a question I have forgotten in the meantime, it seems. But But one aspect, okay, one additional aspect that maybe explain why divisive discourses, why the common experience of subalternity, as Panagiotis put it, does not necessarily lead to the articulation of a common interest of the subaltern. But maybe that's, well, an aspect of what it means to live in a class society, in a capitalist class society, is not only and this generalized culture of insecurity, which is not a new thing, because being a proletarian meant being precisely that, very precarious in terms of you had to sell your labor power to depend on the wage for your own reproduction. But what it also produces, this fundamental class structure, is an aspect of this insecurity is interclass competition. So it is, and maybe that is an aspect that makes, my suggestion would be that if we talk about class and we assume that we have framed thereby already named the solution to the problem, maybe it's more complicated than that, insofar as class in itself is always, capitalism produces interclass antagonisms and interclass competition, and maybe that is what makes in certain historical periods like ours a nationalist interpellation more plausible, because that's maybe the only way to protect yourself as a worker is to claim to be a Croatian worker, to go back to the slide you showed, and maybe that is something that should not be underestimated. And I don't know if that is a productive contribution to what we were trying to discuss, but this is something that I maybe think that it would be necessary to talk more about in the terms of what does class politics imply, and how can you today articulate it in the context where the existing infrastructure of the welfare state is the national state still, like historically. It's as Balibar said, the welfare state was always a national welfare state, or a national social state. Social rights were often are tied to citizenship, with specific rights that come from this. So there is already a dividing line inscribed in this. And my suggestion would be, or my question, is this the reason why, in the lack of an alternative infrastructure and material base for a different kind of class politics, even where class interest, even when it articulates itself from in sense of demands arising from the specific class position of the precarized, the insecure, the working class, that nationalism or the appeal to national solidarity or whatnot becomes a more plausible articulation politically than would be a pure or abstract, or not abstract, but a more universalist class politics, because where is the organizational and institutional framework that would support such a more universalist class politics? And this would also maybe explain why we have now workers who vote for the Front National and so on. And if you assume that they are not complete idiots, and that has some relation to their immediate problems of material life, of their everyday reproduction, of these imperatives that arise from their class position, that this is something that we would have to take into account.
98% of more than half of the old world is in the hands of 2% of people, and it tends to be 1% of people. So we are all in underclass, but some of us don't realize that. We think if we have better life than they in Eritrea or in Yemen, that we are rich, but it's our problem. So we are all in underclass, but some of us don't realize that.
I think that the problem is, or not the problem, but we need to start from realizing that inequalities are only felt relationally. That's why, many have said that injustice is a constant state, but it can only politically become explosive when there are important measurable changes to it. And one of the ways in which we understand the last 10 years is that in a everyday experience, lived experience of people, things are getting worse for the majority. So it's not, I think it's important that though we know all the, aggregate data for countries and how they rank and so on, this is not something that politically can be activated. What is activated is when you feel that you're getting worse off, or vis-a-vis your second generation. Like if you think your children won't be able to own a home or won't be able to have a decent job, that's what can be politically activated as a sense of injustice. And I think that's what we were referring earlier. So this relative worsening of inequality. What I think is different, to refer to what Stipe was saying, why I think the potency of nationalism is stronger in the periphery is because already always it's articulated as if we, a small nation of the periphery, against some kind of external intervention. So the cleavage is a core peripheral one. It's part of the discourse of nationalism as well. It's always an external factor to be blamed for if the common sense is now that we're not doing well, then the reason for that is somewhere outside of us, which is, I think, something that's different than if you look at France today, or with the yellow vest. That's why here I think it's harder to do that. Even though we, as well as a society, can show worsening levels of inequality, politically the problem and the solution is still articulated as if us Croats have been, worse off because of Brussels. That's what Živi Zid is doing.
But will reach that critical point when people are going to realize that? Because in 1995 we were far more rich than Czechoslovakia, than Czech country, than Slovak country, than Polish country, than Romania, and now we are quite down. But people don't realize that. That's the problem. Where is that critical point when people are going to realize that, and how to explain them?
I would argue that they already do. I mean, that's why we see such important changes in the support for mainstream parties. Part of the story that I was telling is also that.
But the Živi Zid is the same hacking.
But they're not.
The same. Okay.
I don't think they are. I think that they articulate a grievance, which says that following Brussels is part of the problem. Yeah?
So I wanted to say what Danijela also said in her first sentence. I'm not sure that people do not realize. They do realize, but that moment which is problematic is that they feel powerless. They do not see what they can do, what we can do as a left to change that. And about nationalism and its reflections on reproduction, I'm not so sure that it has immediate connection in let's say people's heads, because I'm not so sure if that many of right people that tend now to right wing even consider economic policies of their chosen parties. It seems to me that maybe it will sound like a cliche, but that the part of the answer, of course, not always in simple psychological need for retrieval of some kind of dignity, and they cannot find it except in like tribe, well, you can try to make me change my mind because on that I don't see that new voters, protest voters of the right are actually considering and are focusing on economic.
Depends how you define economic. define it as a programs or their own economic situation. That's a different thing.
Yeah, but that's exactly. I was talking about that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there is an important question that has been posed, which is why do people from the subaltern classes, and in particular working class strata, are attached to varieties of right-wing populism? And exactly because we must assume that they are not stupid or they're not, somehow illusioned or something like that. I think the question is that, the far right touches upon some real symptoms of contemporary capitalism, and you mentioned also some of them. They touch upon the violence of globalization, they touch upon the erosion of sovereignty, in whatever sense they present it. They touch about this very, very fundamental disdain of neoliberalism against any form of social cohesion, this deeply rooted kind of competitive cannibalistic individualism, and they touch upon interclass competition. I mean, exactly this kind of deregulated capitalism creates a race to the bottom, and a race to the bottom is not just some abstract statistics. It also means people fighting for the same job or being in a competition. And so if all these grievances and these real problems, these real contradictions are not answered in a left-wing radical emancipatory way, then there is ample room for the far right. And in a certain way, for example, in Europe, the left lost the ability in certain instances to speak on these subjects, and when it did manage to speak on these subjects, it did manage to have a following. I mean, for example, I would say an example, even Syriza, when in its accession to power, although it was Europeanist, etc., it did made a point that it is about sovereignty, it is about popular sovereignty, it is about, some kind of independence or some kind of against Brussels, so it could in a certain way express it. But if we leave this political space and these political questions, then you leave the space open to the far right, even if in certain instances the far right doesn't know what to do it. I mean, take Brexit for example. We know that the original campaign of Brexit originated from some segments of the British establishment who had a kind of even fantasy of Britain being able to regain a more independent role in globalization without the burden of the European Union. The main part of the British establishment was more attached to the European Union, expressed in the position of the city in favor of Remain during the referendum, plus some segments of the political elite, the Conservative Party, which is not exactly a party laboratory of bright ideas in the past year. And we know that this campaign would not have won the referendum were it not for subaltern strata voting heavily in favor of Brexit through considerations that were more real. And the result is a process where the political elite that is trying to negotiate Brexit cannot fully actually perform it in a practical way. So these are real questions that the left should touch upon. I mean, the crucial, of course. I mean, how do you do it? Well, back in some of Marx's writings, especially around 1845, 46, there's always a certain conception of the political constitution of class, when he insists that mass becomes class. You can find such phrases, for example, in the misery of philosophy. I think this is an interesting point to take into, and if you combine it with, it's interesting that in Capital Marx there are not so many references to the proletariat. The proletariat is always for Marx a kind of a more politically constituted, let's say, collective subject or collective non-subject. So you have the objective condition of labor, you have the bearers of these positions, which we can see them as a mass. It's a very complex, very uneven situation, the condition of labor. So it's always, you have, and Marx stresses that, he calls it combinations, the first, the kind of associative practices of resistance, first forms of unions and that. And the question is whether there is some kind of political initiative that can work upon it. So if we sort of project this today, you have a very contradictory condition in working class strata, all forms of working class strata, different contradictions at different level. You have common conditions, you have common demands. The question is it is a question of a relation of forces there. I mean, things can be in a certain way manipulated or turned into, interclass antagonism, racism, manipulation, and attachment to a kind of pseudo community of the nation, or you can work towards the other direction. But the possibility of finding starting points still is in the common, because the common condition of exploitation can also create common conditions of resistances, even at the micro level, micro forms of solidarity, and in a certain way common aspirations. And that's why I insist that even though the big questions, the obvious questions seem like more political than social. I mean, okay, what's the main question today in Europe? I mean, the order of the day is democracy. If you look at what's happening in Paris right now, and right now in a very literal sense, they have, because basically it's like a giant military operation to make impossible to demonstrate. So this is not democracy. You cannot. There are fights. They're not such big fights as last time. Basically, because there is police, armed police everywhere. So you can say it's democracy. But where is it based upon? Where is this demand coming from? Where does it expect? It expects something social. So this is the question of refounding the left as a politics of labor, and not just as as just a political project. And this, I think, also brings us back, if we want to see the weaknesses of the left. I in the morning, as I was in my presentation, I referred that we have to understand the complexity of the functionings of hegemony. If you realize how complex is the entire spectrum of apparatuses that create hegemony, you have to rethink a process of political recomposition of the left as an equally complex process. Of course, you don't have the resources that the bourgeoisie has, but you have many initiatives. So the question is, how do you find means? That would be my idea. How do you? I mean, there is this notion coming from the communist tradition, the United Front, as it appears in the 20s, and also in a certain way as it appeared during the resistance, during the occupation. I think that the United Front is not simply about alliances. It's a more profound reconceptualization of politics. It's the realization that politics is not a kind of metaphysical. There is one class, and then it gets together, and it has its own party. And then a party goes on, etc., etc. It's always much more complex. And you need to create a meeting point. If we start rethinking of the political form as the United Front, as a meeting place, but also a laboratory. I use this is a metaphor also from Gramsci. Then you can counter your lack of resources by trying to get together actually existing initiatives. There are many things happening in contemporary societies, even in societies that seem to be very difficult. There might be trade unions, and not all trade unions are bureaucratic. There might be initiatives, there might be small local resistances, there might be anti-racist struggles, there might be intellectual efforts or endeavors, there might be organizations that they also carry memories, they carry experience, they carry organizing talent, and also they carry theory. The question is, how do you get together all these processes and also attempt to think politics not just as an electoral campaign, but as exactly trying to at the same time expand and converge all these various forms and realize and not use them in an instrumental, because the maximum we see today is to see them in an instrumental way. Oh, that's fine. If this is a very good experiment, vote for us. We are your electoral representation. This is something that we saw. I mean, take the Greek movement. The Greek movement had insurrectional aspects. It had also solidarity aspects. It had self-management aspects. It had new forms of local democracy, etc., etc., etc. But the entire conception of the left was, okay, we want to represent you. So be a member of the organization, or be a part of an electoral coalition. There was never this idea that all these are integral, equally important parts of an organizing effort of getting together and producing a modern prince. And this, I think if we start rethinking the modern prince as this kind of getting together forms of experimentation, forms of politics, forms of theory, this is something that we can work both in the very molecular, small scale practice of recomposition after a big defeat, but also is a way to rethink even the moment when things are happening. And I think this is a very important aspect. We need to find a new way to rethink how contemporary forms of left-wing organization actually have regained an organic relationship with both movements, theory, and politics. So I think this is an open-ended process, but I think, well, at least we know that simply rallying them together around an electoral campaign is not enough. And it's not just simply having an electronic deliberation like Podemos did, or it's not simply creating a digital public sphere. It's not about just okay, yes, anyone can send a proposal and the committees are open. And it's not. We need something a more profound process, which by itself is going to be a terrain of struggle between, let's say, more radical and more reformist positions, etc. So that would be one way to rethink these weaknesses of the left.
Can I jump in just to I mean, this very much echoes some of the things that we're trying to do in Zagreb and Naš, which is all about trying to work with existing actors and see where, both in Zagreb but outside of Zagreb, existing initiatives can be supported, linked up, and so on. But I think the constraint that we encounter is that these are small groups which have been part of, or have, I don't know how to put this, but there is a self-marginalization going on of, being so far away from the, the mainstream and the struggle that this accentuates differences. And there's a lot of work to be done to, because when you're building alliances, this means you can't be pure. You can't be, it can't be the line that you would prefer always. So you have to compromise, and you have to figure out how do you support an initiative, in a neighborhood or in a different town or city, which can grow into a common struggle, but which now maybe has a lot of divergences, or it doesn't sound right, or whatever. And I think here is where the electoral process is important, because if you decide to fight, even if you're losing, but you decide to fight, this changes the perspective for everyone involved, because then they start, I think, to focus more on what's common and less on what's not common. So I do see, that's another argument I would have in favor of contesting elections, even when it's a complete, you're the underdog and there's no way. But contesting elections is a way in which these disparate groups, then it has a feedback effect on them as seeing themselves as part of the same project. And I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear, but in that way I think there is a back and forth dynamic between the two. I just wanted to,
Just two things. The first is on the traces of what Marco was saying about dignity. I think that the sense of dignity is also a response to economic.
Yeah, it is definitely. I preceded it with that. I don't think that it's immediate.
I just want to say that I agree with you. It's because what was Danijela talking about, decent job, that includes some kind of economic security, but also dignity in the sense that when you don't have enough resources, enough money, you cannot socialize in the way you want. If you have this far-right party that offer you some way, be it just pure social demagoguery, or be it like, I don't know, some nights in church when you can socialize with people, offer you something like that, that can also function as attractive offer and providing you some tools to handle with your economic deprivation in a situation when you don't, no one is offering more attractive or more immediate offer to make your life better in sense. So I think that these different responses, be it strictly trade unions, your payment, your wages will go 10%, or this kind of tribal identity, whatever. There are also different answers to not always the same, but the same problem in a sense. And in that way, you could also somehow see how these different cultural and, let's say, class conflicts are somehow interrelated. Not in the sense what are the underlying reasons, how to analyze it, but in the sense that people, parties, movements can respond to economic problems in a, let's say, cultural way, which can be to some people very plausible and can have some impact, but mostly because of the reason there is no a plausible solution, plausible offer from the left. There is no competition in that regard. And also, what is interesting to me in terms what is attractive, what makes this new far-right, right populism, however you want to call it, but you know what I'm referring to, more attractive to some people and to parts of the working class is if we compare the situation, let's say, first half of on the left, on the first half of the end of the 19th, first half of the 20th century, and after it, the worker movements and the Socialist and the Communist Party were always fighting for something to gain the vote, to gain something which was not there before, to expand democracy, to that, in a sense, revolution. And it was, in that sense, for people, it was very attractive. But now, after some gains were there, and with the political history in the last 40 years, as we know it, as we call it neoliberalism, what we now have is just fight to preserve some of the gains and rights which were won in the first part of the 20th century, be it its aspects of the welfare state, some worker rights, or fighting against the different discriminatory attacks on minorities. Also, I think this kind of political history, political trajectory gives the far right this opportunity, which are they using it. They somehow think because of this. Their moment, their anti-establishment moment, is articulated at the time in the sense that they are fighting against specific coalition of the liberal urban elites, which are in some way a product of the post Second World War social mobility, and the coalition between these urban liberal elites and the different kind of minorities, be it sexual minority, be it immigrants, so they have this kind of narrative. Okay, we don't have enough for us jobs or welfare security because there is a secret coalition between the elites and minorities, which is explained by cultural Marxism or whatever. They give something to them, and they can refer to you see how the gay rights are being somehow institutionalized in different countries last 30 years or something like that. They refer to it as a kind of conspiracy between the elites and different kind of minorities against the so-called common people. And also, I have a question for Danijela. When you are thinking a little bit, but referring mostly of the different authors, where to put this new extreme right, new far right, in terms of this horizontal line, anti-capitalism and loving capitalism. I think that this kind of question is mostly there because there is that part on the left when these social democrats are cross, it's empty. When that part is empty, then you can, discuss, and they have enough maneuver room to go between, anti-capitalist rhetorics and some kind of, let's say, capitalist, pro-capitalist stances. And also, I think it's because of these far-right movements are, of course, cross-class alliances, and I think that also they have also the space to maneuver to when they are addressing the different parts of their constituency. And also think that just to add something also to discuss it and have answers it, when Stipe was mentioning Ribon's book, there he explains very plausibly that in terms that in northern part of France, in those industrial or post-industrial hinterland, that the Front National somehow took the role of the Communist Party, but only in electoral sense. They are not there. They aren't organizing on the local level. They're just providing people, offering them, space to articulate their grievances, in a sense. But their electoral success isn't connected to the cultural embeddedness in the social fabric there.
Can I just? I wanted to say I'm listening to this analysis and trying to see ways in which particular Croatian the political conflict in Croatia, or however you want to describe it, the right-wing hegemony in Croatia, how it works and what changes with the introduction of this right-wing populist wave, which articulates some of the resistances to as we described them. So I think if we think of Živi zid as a right-wing populist response, even though this is contested, I don't know if it's really true, but some analysis say that their vote profile is 30% from the social democratic vote. So it's, but initially they were generally a protest party, anti-establishment party, blah, blah. But then they, as we described, Živi zid did introduce this narrative much more stronger, that we were betrayed by our own elites who gave in to Brussels, and we sold out our sovereignty and so on. So this is why we could count them under right-wing populists. I think that in the Croatian context, they will be easily absorbed. This kind of impulse will be absorbed in the right-wing hegemony of HDZ relatively easily, like in the medium term. Why? Because I think we tend to mystify. We on the left tend to mystify the attractiveness of nationalism and right-wing ideas, when actually their foundation is material. And the right-wing hegemony in Croatia is very material. So HDZ is a party of government for 20 years, and it's used. I was telling this story in the break. It used the two key levers of creating clientelist relationships with voters. One is jobs in the public sector and in the state and all levels, and the other is social transfers. And I mean, I like this title from a completely different context from Tides Kotspol about the creation of the welfare state in the United States, which is called Soldiers and Mothers, because I think it captures what happened with reconstituting of the welfare state in Croatia as well. It's created a large program of redistribution targeted, for instance, at veterans and also at reinforcing patriarchal relations. And these are then, materially supporting the Croat Catholic identity, which is the dominant cleavage. And I think we, always tend to underestimate this fact. And it's not cynical to establish this. This is necessary. Hegemony means material conditions and cultural and social for reproduction, where this idea then is embedded in your real life experience. So I think that's a starting point. But But when I think about left strategy, how do we cope with this? This is then a problem if we do realize that the nationalist, this nationalism project is, in a sense, class cleavage. What do I mean? When I look at empirically at the data on programs for veterans, you quickly see, when you disaggregate along municipalities in Croatia, that the large segments of these state transfers go to the poorest areas and to areas which are socially marginalized, economically backward, and so on. So these are, in effect, social programs. Even though they are, at the same time, it's true that they are unjust, because pensions for veterans are 3 times higher, because they go out of work benefits, they're paid out of work benefits even though they're not earned from work. So they are construed in a kind of public discourse as unjust. But I don't think that for us, if we think about what should we do then with this, do we say we need to cut all clientelist levers with voters? I don't think that's an easy project, because we definitely would not want, had we had the opportunity to re-legislate, would we say, oh, we're cutting all the veterans' pensions? That's how I see, class versus identity very linked together.
Maybe I can, just because you touched on this and you framed it in the context of hegemony, we published in the 3rd issue of our journal, a text by Joachim Becker, where he talks about class politics in the periphery. That's the title of the text. And he basically is questioning the applicability of the Gramscian notion of hegemony to the periphery. Precisely why? Because according to him, the notion of hegemony, and Gramscian notion of hegemony, entails not only a combination of consent, the production of consent and coercion, but the production of consent to a large extent also includes, which is often forgotten in more culturalist interpretations of Gramsci, materialist concessions. And now, and then Becker's argument is a properly hegemonic project would have to have the material resources for an universalization of material concessions to the subaltern. Where these do not exist because of the state is in a peripheral position, it's too poor, it doesn't have the resources. Rather than a proper hegemonic strategy, the strategy of stabilization of the existing relations of the political system becomes one of a selective concessions, which then are strategically tied to a logic of quid pro quo, and this is the political economy of clientelism in the periphery, insofar as the proper left response to what you have explained should be. It's not about cancelling. It's not about taking away the benefits of people from the people you have explained who are really at the social margins. It's about universalizing or generalizing that standard of social security rather than taking it away from some, giving it to everyone. But if we take serious, let's say, I was reminded when we were talking of Becker's argument, it would be the very thing that makes clientelistic strategies plausible is precisely the lack of the resources for a generalization of these material concessions. So simply an additional element to think about, and of course one of the effects is a polarization of a creation of inter-class divisions, where you have on one side the privileged veteran population, which is then absolutely tied to the Conservative Party, and on the other hand, those who are left out. And the question now, and this is also, what are the resources? We talk about the weaknesses of the left, not simply in strategic errors, but what are maybe the fundamental organizational and infrastructural means we are lacking for a more plausible type of politics of that type? Of course, you cannot assume that you are all will already be defeated, but if these are some inherent structural limits, that would lead us, even such a question would lead us to question the position of the division of the center and periphery, what produces it and how to question it. So that would entail even something, you know, as seemingly local and specific as the veteran population. Once you unravel it, you again get to the whole divide of core periphery and what it means to be, you know, call it dependent market economy or call it, you know, peripheral capitalism. And that would lead to the next question: to what extent, and it was raised already, to what extent is a realist left politics, realism in the sense of let's not go too far in our goals and aims. Let's not aim at capitalism as such, because that is too abstract and too far away. But the limits, of course, of any type of responsible or realistic left politics would be that you have capital as a barrier. You have to live in a society where basically the decisions on the use and the purposes of the resources and means of material reproduction of society are monopolized in private hands, completely outside of the democratic process, and at the same time a state whose very resources through taxation depend on the successes of this private accumulation of capital. So if you want to use the state, but it is in a dependent position, and capital is the barrier, you know, how far can you come with, you know, with working within the system? So isn't it in that sense even more implausible to suggest that, you know, we can do small-scale politics because the other is too abstract? Whichever thread you pull, you know, you end up with the big questions again. So, does the left, how to, I mean, this is a question, how to navigate this conundrum without at the same time, and we know this type of leftists who have concluded everything, okay, capitalism is the most important thing, and then our response to everything is it's capitalism stupid, and that becomes a meaningless jingle. It doesn't mean nothing anymore. But the task would be, I guess, also to articulate such everyday problems with the central questions, of the social relations, but to do it not merely discursively, but through organization. And if we don't have the state as a resource, and if we are as leftists often skeptical of the state as a resource, what would be immediate? What is the do we have something that we could call a strategic projection of a program for the moment?
Big questions. Yeah, you go first.
Well, I think that the question of the program is very important, and this has always been a very important aspect of both socialist and communist politics, even from German social democracy at the end of the 19th century. And I think that it's always very important because you need, or what was later defined as a transition program, although there's always a big debate what it means, a transition program, etc. But I think that you need, and this is the first, in a way, the first task, you need to have a certain set of goals that actually capture the central questions of the day and articulate a different road, a different narrative, not just an articulation of grievances. In the European left of the past 20 or 30 years, usually this meant anti-austerity, but anti-austerity is not a program. Anti-austerity is a set of grievances, and we don't need. It's what the French used to say, cahier de doléances, the writing down of grievances to be addressed to the sovereign so that he can do it. But this is not enough. For example, for me in the European context, the program would have been an answer to the question of integration, and for me it's imperative that it's a question of sovereignty and democracy, which on the one hand has to do with European integration, on the other hand with a set of radical reforms, radical demands in the national context, plus plus what one might say an alternative productive strategy, an alternative industrial strategy, or whatever you can call it. That means you can suggest that you go beyond simply getting rid of austerity. You need to have this program, you need to elaborate it both in a very meticulous way, based upon the experiences, getting input, but also to have it as translated into very simple, demands. You must have it. You must. I mean, this would sound like Laclausian. You must get your own discursive ground, that you represent a very certain set of goals. You are the political force that insists and repeats that there is no solution without this, without falling into either very realist kind of, always trying to see what is most attractive, neither a crude anti-capitalism that usually talks about revolution without being able to. But I think this would be very, very, very important. And in the contemporary discourse, especially in a period when you have a certain hegemonic inability, I mean, there's no true hegemonic discourse from the part of the forces of capital. There's no big, grand scale, kind of narrative of progress. There's only this cynical reference that there's no way out of the market, no way out of globalization, and basically this combination of this kind of even meaningless repetition of a credo of competitiveness, etc., etc. So there is even a discursive, but also political space that you can occupy. But so there's an alternative. The alternative is we must get rid of this kind of Europe, and we need a different kind of democracy, and we need a different kind of economic policy based upon this demand, but also try to make it both radical but also, seems very accessible to understand for people. So this is one thing. And the other thing I think we need, and then try to test this program. Try to take this program, work it with people in struggles, try get feedback, try influence them, try to understand that their own grievances can only be articulated. So this is basically class politics, and it's trying to get together. And if you do this, you should combine it also with the need for a new political process. It's obvious that in most European countries, there is a need for a new political process of the left. This is not necessarily create a new movement. It can also be a process of recomposition of the existing left plus social forces. But someone should set this question that on the basis of a program, yes, we need a new, very inclusive, open process, get together all the people and movements that can, in a certain way, recognize themselves, but also work to that direction. And then you need you need to rethink what it means, a conception of politics that it is at the same time, it is appealing to people. I'm not saying appealing in a kind of, it covers real needs of them. It's very interesting that if you see, very frightening, if you see some of the forms of organizing of the far right in Europe, they are offering a very complex set of political practices. They combine activism with cultural practices and things like that. So you cannot just offer them, okay, you are in a party, you take part in elections, and you are part of the giant electronic list where you get, email alerts or something like that. You need to offer them a space to think, a space to learn, a space an ability to read forms of party or whatever you can call it, democracy, where they can get their aspiration and it can be heard. So you need to recreate a kind of politics and a kind of organizational culture that would get people to realize that this is what they need. This is a way to change their lives, but also this is what is missing in a certain way from their lives. And also, of course, you need to articulate that always with everyday struggles, small victories, things that get back because one of the problems with a kind of discourse-based electoral politics is that it realizes that people live very everyday lives. They cannot wait for the next election. You need empowering the people means that they get into struggles. This is basically the story of the working class movement. So I think this would be a process of recomposition of the left. And of course but this becomes also with a certain sense of responsibility of the forces of the radical left, and especially the forces of the anti-capitalist left, go beyond the fragmentation, go beyond sectarianism, go beyond the mentality of the small sect, this kind of political egoism that we always encounter, and realize that all current political forms of the radical or anti-capitalist left are the results of a process of crisis, the crisis of let's say, the communist or the revolutionary movement of the past 50 years. So they're like fragments. So they are, by definition, transitory, and by definition they need to have their supersession, in their kind of political Aufhebung in mind. So that's also a political responsibility today.
I don't know who was first, Danijela or...
Okay, I mean, I wanted to say that for the post-socialist context, it's important to remember that for, I don't know, 20 years or more, we only talked about democracy and market. We didn't even mention the word. It didn't exist. Capitalism, and then when some analysis and some public discussions were made, it was the framing was that it's not capitalism that's the problem, but our implementation of capitalism that is wrong. So we had the wrong kind. It's political capitalism, crony capitalism, whatever. All of these different variants, which were saying that it's because how we did it that it has worse outcomes, and if we did it properly, then it would have, social benefits and all of that. So that has changed. I think today it's mainstreamed, this kind of dissatisfaction with capitalism. We can say it. It's not an unsayable thing, and I think that we can. If now I speak from the perspective of someone who tries to speak as a left actor, I think it is possible to say something along the lines of what you suggested, to say to people everywhere, and in the media or wherever, to say what it means to live in a capitalist democracy. What are the implications of that, which are not local and specific, but general. And the general implication is a structural dependence on capital, on private owners, which make decisions on investment and employment. I think that's, this is something that will not fall on deaf ears. People realize this. This is something that's not now, it's not too, complex. And what that then means. I do think that we are able to say that directly. And plus, so that the investment and employment decisions are in the hands of private owners of capital, plus the fact that they have no barriers to living and so on. So all of these things. Let me just see. And that this entails for a left program that indeed to make real long-term and structural changes, transformative changes, we need to bring back, democratic control over production. I think that we can really say this. And I don't think this is, but that doesn't mean that anything that improves the living conditions is trivial. Because if what we were saying earlier is true, then the trip or the trip to transformation is only as fast as it has democratic support. And if we want to be able to build, cultural and social and all this kind of hegemony, which means building and your own constituency, then yes, indeed, every project which will be revolving also around reformist ideas of progressive taxation and strong universalist redistributive programs is part of the package, I think.
Just to add, the interesting thing, the neoliberals have been saying it all along. They have been openly declaring the limits of capitalist democracy, but they had a peculiar way of phrasing it. They said the markets won't allow it. The markets will react like this, like that. If you replace that with capital, you have the truth about most of... they said,
Right. So this imperative is there all the time. Yeah, that's true.
And they're not hiding it. How will the markets react? What will the markets say? Will the markets allow this? This is populism. Why? Because the rationality of the market. If you replace markets with capital, you have a socialist argument almost, you know.
Yeah, but that's always construed as something that's unchangeable. That's
That's the problem.
Natural order of things.
But that's precisely. If you assume capital is given, then democracy has to be the variable. If you assume that the democracy is a given, well, you have to switch it around.
Yes.
But that was just.
Yes, exactly. I agree.
You already said before everything what I wanted to add to this discussion, and we talked during the break something on that line of previous conversation about the economic weakness of the left. So it's already obvious that our political weakness is somehow connected with with economical weakness of our organization, but not just on that level. Building the alternative economic strategy or industrial strategy, as Danijela said, from the beginning, embedding it from the beginning, means not just putting together papers, policy papers for the day one when you win the state, and then you will start. Then you will start to implement your industrial strategy, because probably on that very day you will confront yourself with the strike of the capital, and. But thinking about alternative economic strategy from the embedding it from the beginning, for me means thinking in terms of building alternative economic institutions, and now we are stepping into the field. We have or at least I'll talk to myself. I have a certain problem with that, because we on the left have over the years developed some sort of scorn to alternative programs of some of our comrades dedicated to agricultural production, for example, in some communal sense, or you know what I'm talking about. Dressed in white, singing together, and doing something in organic agriculture. We are used to some political scorn on such sort of alternative economy. But I do believe that we need to think about alternative economic institutions in a different sense, because as you said, we need to offer our activists not just political project they can fit in, but also the economic security, the place to work. Not maybe from that point of having in mind some alternate, very obviously very crude and simple alternative economic structure. For myself, the term decent job will sound something like over-promising. But anyway, I do believe that source of self-appreciation and identity in that imaginary will come from other sources, not necessarily from a competitive position of my profession or my competitive position as a labor force on the market. It's also good to expand on that alternative institutions. It doesn't necessarily mean that we just need to think about different cooperatives in agriculture or energy production or something like that, but also alternative institutions in terms of, for example, communication, because that means to deconstruct the field of power struggles. If we are in that same basic channel of power struggle, then we obviously have certain huge weaknesses we already identified. But if we manage to build more alternative institutions, like different communication networks, for example, then maybe that power struggles could look different.
Yeah, I think that you may be one step ahead. I think that for us here, in the first place, the main weakness is that there is so few of us, actually. So few leftists in Croatia to engage in such projects. I think, you know, we have all have our own fields of struggle, and mostly they are reactive because the offensive is on the way. And I'm not sure that we have resources to build such organizations that, if I understood you right, would gain us with some kind of financial background and also, ideological legitimation of our program.
But it's connected. Also the other way. There are just a few of us because there is no economic perspective for more people.
Okay, maybe, yeah, maybe.
I think, your point is very important. Building an alternative strategy is not something that goes for day one when we have power. It's something that we can start working upon now. And I think there are some points where we can already start. First of all, you have the public sector. The public sector is not just, about administration. A large part of it is a kind of a productive kind of field. You have the health sector, which mainly is public. You have education. You even still have publicly owned companies, for example, in most European countries. And they are also places that are heavily unionized. They're much more unionized than and the rest of the economy, where private sector is really difficult to unionize. So, if you had a different, let's say, movement inside these places, this would not only be about, the everyday trade union activity. It would also be a way to, make suggestions, make proposals, work upon how is it functioning, how it could function better, how it could function differently, and especially in the contemporary context, where usually the idea is that you should always get someone from the outside, get someone from the private sector to run things in a better way. The people who actually know, have the knowledge, are the people actually working. If you have a movement as a part of mobilizing these people in their demand, but also mobilize them in order, let's think what it means to run a hospital in a different way. Let's think what it means to run a publicly owned company in a different way. Let's say what it means to run a school in a different way. You can have a kind of elaboration of a program that is not just a set of trade union demands. You move towards elements of an alternative economic strategy. And also, that's one point. Secondly, this could also go for union or union-like activities in other, movements in other forms of representation that can also work to that direction. I will give an example. In certain, when the movement is on the rise, you see this element. For example, I remember, because in Greece it was always traditionally very important, engineers, because they were the force of growth, especially, and the big construction, but also big industrial boom after the World War II. And they were also, some of them coming from the student radicalization of the 60s and the 70s. So in the 1970s, you would have the Association of Engineers, which is nominally should have been also be rather to the left. So you could get proposals, you could get projects out of them. They were developmentalist, they were contradictory, but they were also interesting because they were doing the collective effort. And it's always a sign of strength of the left. Then it has even the arrogance, I would say, to suggest an alternative. I will also give an example of the history. There was a book by an economist attached to the Communist Party that came out in the 1940s. I think that was 1947, 1948. The economists would be later be executed along Belogiannis. We all know Belogiannis, but there were actually 4 of them that were executed that day, and one of them was Dimitris Patsis. So he wrote a very impressive book. It was called Heavy Industry in Greece, and it was a kind of a fully fledged alternative industrial strategy. Of course, it was within the kind of, more economistic, but it combined actual knowledge, and there was a kind of such movement, especially if you get intellectuals on board. And there was an expression that the left, the communist movement of that period, even during the Civil War, it had this idea we can think how we can have an alternative strategy. So, and we have people that can think of it in movements, and this is something to work. This is one aspect. It means collective thinking based upon being able to know. And by the way, if we think in terms of developmental economics, this is something gradually missing in Europe, especially in the context of European integration. You start to have a lack of knowledge inside administration. I mean, in Greece, in some ministries or in state-owned banks, like the National Bank of Greece, which was state-owned, or ministries, Ministry of Industry, Ministry of Agriculture, you could get people that actually knew. They had knowledge. I mean, for you it's much more evident as an image how the state would actually be also a place of knowledge, knowing what's happening. In contemporary terms, you might have people in the ministries that are ultra able to fill in the technical data to get a European funding. But if you ask them, you're covering that area of the Greek economy on the administrative part. Do you know what is happening? Do you know what are the characteristics of production? What kind of productive units are there in an area? What kind of technology they use? No, you won't find it because because we have run out of old school kind of Keynesian, capitalist planning or developmental politics, and there's a lack of knowledge. So it's, in a certain way, getting the movement and people from the movement to work is important. But also you can also experiment. I mean, one of the weaknesses, since we're talking about weaknesses of the left, in the Greek situation, which is always, I mean, we talk about Argentina. Argentina went something like Greece, even, I don't know if it was worse, but it was very bad. Well, in certain instances, it was. We all talk now about, occupied factories, the law about self-management, etc., etc. This is an actual form of how you create alternatives and you experiment and you learn before. In Greece, we had very few examples. Very few examples of self-managed experiments in the period of crisis. There are very reasons for because of the perennial attitude of the working class movement in Greece to basically demand from the state instead of, having this attitude that we ourselves can do something, etc., etc. But this was a weakness. Because how can you develop an alternative productive paradigm if you don't start today, if you don't actually start today? And you could have all these people inside and outside of Syria, and I'm talking about, yes, we need a third sector, we need social economy, we need self-management, and we will use it as part of. And what was that? The kind of social economy advanced from the European Union. I mean, like social cooperatives that are already in place, and we know that however important they are, they cannot account for the kind of self-management. And being in Yugoslavia, you know very well that self-management is something that's more deeper and profound. So so yes, indeed, you start now. You don't just wait for the next day, and this also is a way to empower the movement, because the more successful examples you have, the more plausible then an alternative might seem.
Maybe to follow up on this, because what has been mentioned, with Danijela introducing the notion of decent jobs and decent employment, and saying it's not only about economic security, while to a large extent, of course, it always is, but that this was also a source of identity, of social pride, something which activates you, because we know from the opposite side, like with research on long-term unemployed or precariously employed, that there is also a form of self-exclusion, shame attached to not being productive, part of society. So precarization also produces demobilization on a political level, and even one can argue maybe even deeper than that. It pushes people into self-isolation and blah blah and so forth. We know that there are what is work being done on the effects of neoliberalization and precarization on mental health and so on. So these are really deep-running consequences of precarization. So this is also one product of precarization. We can speculate to what extent this is or is not calculated. I wouldn't dare to go so far, but it is an effect which makes governing or governance easier, and this is an important aspect also of atomization. But so your emphasis is absolutely justified, of course, but the irony is, of course, that the historical left always knew this. Not only about the job as a source of identity, but that the left, the working class movement, the socialist, the historical working class movement, always provided also a social and cultural context. It was also not only the job where you was part of your identity, but being part of the movement was part of the identity. It had its own institutions. We all know the grand success story of the German social democracy up until the beginning of World War I. But they built a parallel society with their own newspapers and hospitals and education. So there was an entire culture which was a source of pride. And also in that sense. And that is also something maybe that the erosion of institutions and organizations, that it also contributes to this complete lack of social self-esteem. We're all profoundly social animals, and in that sense being pushed in a position of irrelevance is a scarring experience. It is demobilizing. It is destructive of the human personality, of what we consider to be health, mental health even. So to add to this, not only decent jobs, but also a broader culture of the left that would facilitate an affirmative social identity rather than what it is now, like this, this more often than not, as you have alluded to, sectarianism, egotism, this blame game, and so on. And we all know that the left can be a very scary place to be involved in. Very scarring in itself.
If you promise to people that you spend like 8 to 10 hours of work, and then you go to about 3 or 4 hours of political meetings where you basically lose your time, basically demonize whoever is more close, basically discuss how you are going to beat the demonized fraction, which is usually the most closer, that's which is closest to you, etc., etc. This is not exactly a decent kind of life, for sure.
This is not a culture that would encourage the development of participation, and it's not an empowering experience. It's quite the opposite often.
I think maybe part of the problem or weaknesses of the left is the lack of an internationalist perspective, or it's very difficult today to have an internationalist perspective, which I think was always fundamental to the leftist identity. And I think right-wing nationalists think of themselves as more realist than spoiled middle-class leftist intellectuals who have the privilege to think of a better world. And they actually try to do what the left used to do. Gramsci said that the workers were the internationalist class, and the intellectuals were the narrowly, because of the languages, different languages were the narrowly nationalists. But today I think it's much more complicated because of the transnationalization of production. And inside every country, the gap between different strata of work is so, the gap is so wide that actually the nationalists, through nationalism, are trying to nationalize themselves and have a maybe more decent version of capitalism, because they have this idea that different world is not possible. So I think maybe building a global perspective, international leftist global perspective is necessary. You mentioned this like core and periphery, but usually this periphery stops at Eastern Europe, and I think we should go much more east to, I don't know, Bangladesh and stuff. And it has a lot of our clothes is made there, and a lot of these processes are directly connected to us. And I think maybe here on a discursive level we can make a move to show like this is not living hell. Living hell is more to the east, and maybe in a discourse we should maybe. I'm talking about the working conditions in some countries, and I think maybe this should be more, have a wider representation in the media and in the leftist discourse. And for example, one example of this is the Kurd revolution, which nobody is talking about. And I think it's like the Spanish Revolution that is happening now, but nobody's talking about it. So I think we have to have a much wider, to help people imagine a different world. I don't know. And not just, of course, middle-class intellectuals can imagine a different world, but I think the left has to help other people also imagine this world. So, I don't know.
Now that we have to raise the task of this task to worldwide solidarity. It's
well, representation is the first step.
No, I fully understand what you're saying, of course, but
I'm not really happy with that sense of solidarity. I think it's a matter of economic independence of a political movement. It all started sometime at the 19th century with the voluntary contributions of what will once become a labor union. It started with a membership fee in left political parties. And then it expanded here or there with certain cooperatives that would in a food production or distribution or something like that as a source of extra income for funding of political work. It is known, which is somehow peculiar, that you couldn't be the candidate in 1930s, I think. You couldn't stand as a candidate for a function in Belgian Socialist Party, for example, if you were not regularly buying food at a cooperative store, which was run by the party and affiliated labor union members. Of course, this all may sound naive from today's perspective, but on the other hand, we need to wait for some internet entrepreneurs to call it crowdfunding and offer that model to us that we collect our contributions to finance, for example, some left-wing media. So my question is, can we expand our political and organizational imaginary a little to find some forms of alternative funding for the start, and then to think about different forms of alternative institutions, for example, like solidary healthcare. With dynamics of how the public healthcare systems are being left down the drain. Soon we will need to organize, some sort of solidary, free of charge hospitals for those in need. So we will very soon we will need material sources to finance these hospitals. if we will not let also that part for the charity, and you know.
Well,
you know what I'm talking about.
No, I think it's a good definition of solidarity. So that when we say solidarity, it's not a vague sentiment, it's a form of practice. That is necessarily what it comes down to. If there, well, we can continue if there is need and will. Otherwise, we can call it quits for today and continue more tomorrow. At least those of us who will still be here. I expect most of you will be. Panagiotis is flying back to Athens, unfortunately, tomorrow already because of obligations on Monday. But the rest of us, or most of us, I expect will can continue tomorrow. Tomorrow's program will start also at 11. The whole program tomorrow will be in as we say, BHS, Bosnian, Herzegovinian, Croatian, and Serbian, what used to be called Serbo-Croatian. And because, well, the Germans and Slovenes that were supposed to be here never cancelled, and the one Greek we have among us will be gone tomorrow, so we can switch to our language, yes. Again. Okay. Thank you. Thank you all.